So, welcome, fellow sufferers. So, I have talked about China and Russia and Iran in contemporary world affairs. Today is the US. And next time, I will pick up the pieces with other countries who may not be global powers, but sometimes have international reach in Latin America, Southeast Asia, India, Indonesia, Germany. My voice is perfectly okay until I get to this room and I start coughing. I try not to be too academic, but tolerate me for a moment. I want to spend a few minutes sounding like an academic. The modern world system of states is, generally speaking, set to go back to the 17th century, 1640, and the end of the 30-Year War, when the state system started evolving. And you had all kinds of political entities historically, empires, city-states, and so forth. But the idea arose of having smaller entities, which eventually, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, were called nation states. Now, we use nation and state interchangeably, but actually, technically, they're quite different things. A nation is nothing more than a group of people who believe themselves to belong together. That belief can arise through common historical experience, joint language, religion, all kinds of things. And the bottom line here is, do the people themselves believe to be part of that entity? A state is actually a legal category. It's a territory that has a defined border, that has a population living inside that defined border that identifies as living there. It has a government that has the capacity to govern, and it is recognized by other similar units, in other words, other states, as existing as a state and enjoying sovereignty. Does that make sense? And the evolution over some centuries was to produce a state which was a hyphenated nation state. In other words, a group of people who mostly, not every single human, mostly believe themselves to belong together, who at the same time were in this recognized legal territory. Now, who needs to recognize you as being in that legal territory? Other states. In modern times, it means the United Nations and your flag gets hoisted in front of the United Nations. Now, all entities that would like to be states aren't necessarily given those benefits or those rights. For example, when South Africa declared Bantustans in South Africa to be states, only 2 or 3 other states in the world recognized them as sovereign states, so they didn't join the family of states. The Kurds would love to be a state, but they're a nation of people who believe themselves to belong together, who don't have this entity of a territorial state. Now, how is this all relevant? Well, before I get to that, let me add some other things. When the state system evolved, and certainly by the time you get to the 19th century, you have 2 things going on. One, the slow evolution and codification of international law. International law originally was considered to be natural law. That is to say, things that just made sense to people or that were God-given or something of that order. So over centuries, there were rules out there in the world which had to do, for example, with maritime travel. What kind of flag you had to put up on your boat, what it signified in wartime on land, hoist a white flag. That means, you know, for the moment you have a negotiation, you're not going to shoot. Lots and lots of law that countries voluntarily adhere to because they perceived it to be in their national interest to adhere to those things, because otherwise there would be some kind of chaos. By the time you got to the 20th century, you have added to that something called positive international law, which was legislated international law. In other words, treaties and rules that were legislated that people signed onto, which were meant to govern their behavior. Now, why is any of this relevant? It's relevant in the sense that by the time you get to the 19th century and very much to the 20th century, states bound themselves to behave in certain ways through the international law, and treaties, by the way, are part of international law, so that there would be more order, more peace, more economic benefit, and so forth. So that's one pattern. This 19th century also started a third thing, which was the idea that states could get together, for example, in conferences, and make uniform decisions. So you have the conference of, you might have heard of them, God knows, in school or whenever. If you can, we can all go back to when we went to school. It's a long time for most of us. For example, you had conferences, let's say the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, which the existing states, some were nation states, some were becoming nation states, divvied up the world and 2/3 of the world into colonies. They got together and they organized things. But there were also other conferences, for example, the Conference of Vienna, which sorted out and developed rules, for example, for diplomats. The fact that diplomats were safe in the country that they traveled to, the fact that the embassy was part of the territory of the country whose embassy it was, even though it was in a different country. So you had groups of states organizing to do things uniformly, which became legal, and on the whole, it would be embarrassing not to adhere to what you have agreed to. Okay, you get to the First World War, and at the point of the First World War, at the end of the First World War, you have what we in America called liberal internationalism. We had Woodrow Wilson come along, who, by the way, nowadays is much criticized because he was a racist, but for many years, Woodrow Wilson was considered one of these ideal characters. The reason was that he very much pushed for the League of Nations. Notice, by the way, the use of nations in the sense is a misuse, but never mind. In the legal sense, a League of Nations. And as you also, the idea was that you wanted to move the conference machinery and the legal machinery that had its embryonic foundings in the 19th century, you wanted to move that into a more formalistic and global organization, right? And America and Woodrow Wilson and his supporters were enthusiastic advocates of the League of Nations. As you probably also remember from your school days, that the U.S. then decided not to join the League of Nations because our Congress voted against joining because we were isolationists, we could do things on our own, and we didn't need this particular organization. The argument, of course, was a more serious argument, which was that if you joined such a mechanism, that there were rules and regulations, excuse me, that would bind you to behave in certain ways. And that was considered then, and by the way, by many considered now, an inappropriate giving up of sovereignty, right? No one should tell you what to do. You shouldn't bind yourself in any particular way. So we didn't join the League of Nations. What you also had was the development in the 19th century of an international court system, which slowly, I won't go through all the steps, but by the time you get to the League of Nations, you really have something which resembles the International Court of Justice nowadays. And by the way, by the time you get to the United Nations, the International Court of Justice became one of the formal organs of the United Nations, right? There are other international courts now, but in any event. Now, we make so much to do today about economics and globalization and so forth. And a lot of that is sort of serious nonsense or semi-nonsense, because globalization is not a 20th or 21st century phenomenon. There was globalization in the 19th century and to some extent even in the 18th century. Why? Because, as you know, there was an enormous amount of trading going on. There were corporations in the 19th century, which were transnational corporations. So that even though the type of globalization we have nowadays, and specifically, of course, given technology and the media, was unheard of in those days. But to say it was a new 21st century phenomenon is also not true. And because countries had international economic interests, right, you began to have ideas that some of the economic activity also needed to be legislated law, which would regularize behavior. One of the ironies, to just jump ahead, was that one of the things that was needed was an international postal organization, so that letters could frequently, and packages could frequently flow from country to country. And you remember, was it 2 weeks ago, when Trump decided we wanted out of the International Postal Organization and treaty. But that he's forgotten about that for the moment. So we're still in there. But in any event, some of these things which seem very modern actually have sort of fairly long historical antecedents. And I'm not pushing this just to bore you with history, but rather to say that the process of getting from there to here has been a very slow and careful process. Now, the role of the U.S., which is what I'm supposed to be talking about today, of course, has in many ways historically been somewhat of a fiction, right? That is to say, we claim, for example, we were not a colonial power. Well, we were certainly not England and France, but we also had colonies. I mean, think Philippines, Cuba, whatever. So to begin with, that is sort of a fiction. We're a new nation, and you were call again from school that George Washington says no entangling alliances, right? Well, of course, we had entangling alliances from the very beginning of one kind or another. We had different values. Our Constitution, a marble, still is a marble for all to see, made us feel secure in the notion that unlike any other state, we were different. Right. And part of it was absolutely true, and to some extent is true, but part of it has always been a fiction. And I say this not to just be critical, but to rather say that when you look at the present, we have this idea that everything is now totally different than it used to be. But what I want to point out to you is that there has been a trajectory of American exceptionalism not being quite as exceptional as we Americans tend to think about it, right? We like to pat ourselves on the head about being totally exceptional, totally different, and therefore also more virtuous. Now, our virtue came to the fore, of course, in the Second World War and right after the Second War, where certainly, how the Second World War ended was much assisted, if not determined, by the United States. And it's also remarkable that at the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt managed to do what Woodrow Wilson wasn't able to do, which is to lay down a marker and say we now have to organize the world differently. right? We have to have a United Nations, which, as you know, sort of had its embryonic form during the Second World War and then was finalized. But we also need lots of institutions which foster global, dare I use the word, it wasn't used at the time, international, transnational institutions. And if you can imagine your image of the United Nations, it's not just a central institution, it's this myriad of other institutions, which to varying degrees have become absolutely essential in our life. Look at the moment at the WHO. The WHO, if we're going to be rescued from this pandemic, it will be with the help of the WHO, right? And it's, you know, what's your average American has never even heard of the WHO or knows it exists. Many of these institutions, right, have atrophied to some extent. We can discuss that. But in any event, at the end of the Second World War, you had this absolutely avalanche of institution building, which were international institutions. By and large, who were the members? The members were sovereign states, right? And they were more or less all states. Now, within that structure, the victorious states of the Second World War had the most power. That's who the permanent members of the UN Security Council were, the victors in the Second World War, and that's raised some question, and it should be expanded, but it hasn't been, and all the rest of it. But we didn't just help foster an international system of institutions at the end of the Second World War. We were, whatever suffering the U.S. encountered during and right after the Second World War, we came out the strongest, the richest country in the world. And we were able to throw down a marker everywhere in the world. Why and how? Through the Marshall Plan, through helping rebuild Europe, through encouraging the development of the European Union, to being the dominant force in the two financial institutions, namely the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank, by the way, was called originally the International Bank for Reconstruction of Development, and the idea was to help reconstruct Europe, but development was added from the very beginning, and very quickly it morphed to assist the rest of the world of one fashion or another. Who paid the piper of these institutions? It was done by and large by percentages, I'm generalizing, of the potency of the economy. And since the U.S. was the strongest economy in the world, it paid the highest percentage of the dues to the UN, to its agency, to the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank, right? So it is, in fact, accurate for those who criticize the institution nowadays to say, we, the United States, we, the taxpayers, were the massive contributors to the development and the sustaining of the international system. And certainly the countries that we helped reconstruct, and certainly the people that we, imagined us to have helped reconstruct them, look very favorably on the United States. Now, not only because we paid the money to help reconstruct and operate the international system, but also because our values seem to be the values of the future. Democracy, human rights, civil rights of one kind or another. Now, we can easily step back very quickly and say, well, didn't intelligent people in the rest of the world realize that to some extent what we were peddling was hypocritical? I mean, for example, why didn't people know about slavery and discrimination and civil rights and the inequality in the United States and the lack of social institutions and so forth? Yes, well-read, smart people knew all of that. Still, we were so much better than what they had experienced that we were still idolized by and large. And by the time you get into the Cold War, of course, there was fear of Russia, Soviet Union, communism, and who was in a position to counter that? The United States, right? So we were, even for the most cynical people overseas, we were in a position to safeguard the world against communism, against the nuclear conflict. We were still the most potent economy. And even though people knew the supposed values we were peddling, we sometimes ourselves didn't adhere to them, we were still better than what most of them experienced at home. Although some tried to emulate the US after the Second World War in terms of institutions, democracy, and so forth. So you get to the 50s and the 60s, and to some extent the 70s, and even until the 80s. And what you have is the US as the dominant power in the world, with Russia out there, which we talked about last time, not being dominant economically and socially and whatnot, but also the counterweight in terms of arms and ability to blow up the world. That's still true, by the way. It's Russia and the United States. Okay, then you get to the 1989, the end of the Soviet Union, and you go from a world of the 50s and 60s, which generally speaking was tagged as a bilateral world, right? The United States and the Soviet Union, and then all these small fry around of one kind or another. Parallel to this, you have the decolonization, and the United Nations system and non-governmental organizations in the UN tried to foster decolonization and to help the colonies to some extent. That's a whole nother sort of train of thought. When the end of the Soviet Union came, we moved from a bilateral world to a unilateral world, to US being the hegemon in the world, right? And the word hegemonic power comes up everywhere. And the real sad matter is that we blew it in the 90s, started blowing it in the 90s, and are still doing it, because while we were a hegemon and could have done terribly useful things in that particular position, two things happened. On the one hand, of course, you have, certainly by the 80s and the 90s, the rise of China, which then becomes more serious. So that was at least an opposition, right? You still have the two nuclear powers, but Russia is a weak country. We talked about that last time. Then you have the rise of China, potentially looking like it might carry some weight down the road. But what really happened, it seems to me, and we can argue about it, is by the time you get to the Bush administration, we essentially started not only doing dumb things like the Iraq War, but we also started losing interest by and large in the world. I could detail you a pattern of loss of US engagement and interest through the 1990s. So that in a sense, the US gave up its hegemony slowly, bit by bit, and we're only beginning to notice it now, more or less, right? It's taken us a while to notice, but it happened bit by bit. Basically, Bush did many stupid things, but one of the things that actually, in an odd sort of way, he shares with Trump was a loss in interest in the world. Not really knowing much about it, not being particularly interested in it. Of course, he had better people around him, more knowledgeable people around him than Trump does, but he wasn't just terribly interested in the world. And that came across to an increasingly potent and self-assured Europe, to a China that was interested in moving ahead and didn't much care about the US at that particular point. So the fiasco of Iraq, if you want to tag it to a particular thing, the fiasco of Iraq and Bush, generally speaking, this interest in the universe began the slide down for the US. And I want to say very many in-between things, but let me quickly now move to the present so we see where this winds up. But, you know, Clinton administration was internationalist, but somewhat focused on domestic stuff. You get to Obama. Obama, in many ways, we all liked Obama. Most of us liked Obama. He was very good in many ways. But he wasn't himself terribly knowledgeable about foreign policy. And that's one of the problems when we elect we imagine ourselves to be the dominant actor in the world. And we have presidents who know very little about the world when they come into power. The difference between Obama and some others is that he surrounded himself with, intelligent people who could plug the hole. When Obama was president, many of the international institutions that were built after the Second World War started fraying, started becoming too bureaucratic, starting not to be focused enough, starting to have iffy leadership. And at that particular point, the U.S. needed to weigh in heavily to revitalize those institutions. And it by and large didn't. So that by the time you get to Trump, it's perfectly correct to say that many of the international institutions that he likes to badmouth or consider irrelevant, in fact, aren't functioning very well. And of course, the trade-off it would be, for him, the trade-off is let's stop paying those institutions, or let's stop, participating in them, because they're useless anyway and we don't need them, versus the other side of the coin of people saying what badly needs to be done is that the U.S. needs to put shoulder to the wheel to help revitalize these institutions because they're actually still needed. Now, without going through a litany of every institution, let me pick one that Trump is actually interested in, which is the World Trade Organization. Right? The World Trade Organization, which is supposed to manage tariffs and trade and dumping and all those good things that can go wrong in international trade. It's a really important organization because it means that if you're going to have global trade, there's got to be somebody to see if people are behaving counter to the rules of the game and making life difficult for the international trading regime that everybody has an interest in one way or another. Okay? So that particular organization needs shoulder to the wheel on the part of a major trading country like the United States. What is Trump doing? Trump is essentially decimating the organization. In order for that organization to adjudicate between trade disputes, it needs judges. It has a panel of judges which study these cases. And the panel of judges, people retire, they quit and so forth, needs new appointments. And since Trump has come into power, he has refused to appoint any new judges. So at the moment, WTO, which would be very useful for managing international trade, is basically has very little capacity. And that's before Trump even says we should get out of it. They're useless. We don't have to pay attention to them. Well, the reason we don't have to pay attention to them is because they don't have a capacity to do anything right now. Right? So that's just one kind of institution. Ditto with, let's say, the World Health Organization. We don't need the World Health Organization. We may have a plague. Those guys may want to go over there and see what's going on. But we have our own CDC. We don't need them. We can manage ourselves. We don't need those kinds of things. So the disregard that the Trump administration is paying is not just lack of interest and lack of new funding and lack of saying it's worthwhile for us, the taxpayer, to put money in back of these organizations. It's actually trying to get rid of the organization, to get the U.S. not to be members of some of these organizations and to not pay any particular attention. Let me give you one more illustration and then I'll quit on this particular subject. The United Nations has an arm that has peacekeepers, right? And small conflicts, not necessarily small conflicts, but in small countries, very often have been assisted by UN peacekeepers. There are problems with them. Haiti was a mess and so forth. You can ask me about that later. But by and large, UN peacekeepers make a difference. One country that's in a total mess right now is the Congo. And the Congo is a very major country, and it's in total disarray. But it's not just a question of a country in chaos, it's also a country where the Ebola virus is present again, which raises potential international issues, right? So it's really, really important for peacekeepers to try to stop the conflict and to try to stop various marauding groups killing health workers who are trying to manage the Ebola virus, right? Why are they killing health workers? Because those guys don't believe Ebola is a real thing and whatever. So what do? We just announced we're reducing American contribution to peacekeeping for the Congo, right? So I can go down, spend the next half hour going down through litany of those kinds of things. So the U.S. is disengaging from the world. And what we're saying is, if you listen to the State of the Union, we're the most powerful, respected country in the world, right? And more or less everybody in the world knows that that's not true, right? You can read some schlag newspaper in England, like the Daily Mail, and you know that it is not true that the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. So then the question, of course, is what do we mean by power? If by power means our nuclear capacity is as great or greater than Russia, of course we're militarily the most powerful country in the world. And we're obviously intending to maintain that. Notice the budget proposal of Trump's yesterday, military aid going up, whatever. But power, as we've discussed before, comes in both soft and hard power. Hard power is your military power. Soft power is your diplomacy, your negotiating, your capacity to influence, maybe economically, maybe socially, maybe technologically, maybe in different ways, right? And so Trump is completely correct. We are the most powerful country in the world, but it's only hard power, military power. Our soft power has eroded incredibly in the last few decades and has eroded incredibly under the Trump administration. Now, if you imagine that most of the power that's needed to manage the world is in fact soft power, persuading others through diplomacy, through, joining in common enterprises of one kind or another, then in fact what we've had is a cataclysmic reduction of U.S. power. So it all depends on how you want to talk about it, right? You want to talk about it one way? Yeah, we're the most powerful country in the world, and we're going to make ourselves even more powerful. However, even in military terms, the military hardware power raises questions of the usability of the hard power that you have. So unless you imagine that we're going to use nuclear weapons of one kind or another, then the question is, do we have is the rest of our hard power really up to par the way it used to be? And that also raises questions, because there are all kinds of aspects of military activity which in fact have been weakened, right? Not to question, not even the moral questions of having overridden the military high command on the military who committed crimes and things of that sort, right? So, yes, talking about it in a certain way, you can certainly go to a Trump rally and he says we're more powerful than we've ever been before, and he sure is right. Or you can stand here in Santa Cruz and say it's like 100% wrong unless you talk about, nuclear power. Now, I want to spend another 2 or 3 minutes on this hard power, military power. Some of it raises not just do you have the hardware, but also raises, do you have the capacity to use it? And by capacity to use it means not only if you use it, will it actually work, but also can you deploy it, and what does a deployment of it mean? So let me give you an illustration of last week, just to be current here. In the 1970s, 80s, 90s, an international landmine treaty was developed. Landmine treaty that 164 countries out of the 200 are now signatories of. And the reason that landmine treaty was developed, the impetus, by the way, for it was Canadians and Canadian NGO. The woman her name was Williams, even got the Nobel Peace Prize at some point, you might recall it. So the reason landmines are so horrible is because they are a particular regular landmines, not landmines that blow up tanks, but civilian landmines, have been strewn all over the world, and they cause incredible harm. For any of those of you who've been to Cambodia, you might have seen Cambodians of different ages, including young people, with missing limbs. And the reason they're missing limbs is because they went to their father's field or something, and a landmine blew up on them. Countries like Cambodia and Mozambique in Africa are absolutely strewn with landmines. And it's incredibly expensive to defuse landmines, because if they're not marked, and very careful teams go out there with dogs and whatnots, and very often people still get killed in trying to defuse landmines. And developed an international consensus that this particular kind of hard power weapon is so inhumane and so destructive of what? Civilian populations. And who's not supposed to be targeted in warfare and in conflict? Civilian populations, right? So this landmine treaty exists, but the U.S. is not one of the 164 signatories to it. The reason the U.S. didn't sign it is because it said it needed to be able to use landmines, anti-personnel landmines, along the South-North Korean border. That was the explanation. So we didn't sign it. Okay. However, we were pretty good about it. We stopped manufacturing and selling landmines in the sort of end of the 20th century. And the landmines we did produce were the kind that self-destruct. They don't blow up, but the mechanism to blow up is self-destructs after 4 months or 2 months or 3 months. It can be set. So we behaved rather well, actually, for a couple of decades on this landmine issue. You might have noticed, if you read the New York Times, we are going back into the landmine business, the anti-personnel landmines, and some of them will be more lethal than they've ever been before. We're also going back into missiles with nuclear warheads, which violates various arms treaties. So even what we used to agree to in terms of delimiting hard power and making it consistent with international law, which says individuals should not be targeted, we are now going backwards on this. Okay, and that's part of our current budget. Then, just while I'm at this, one of the treaties that also came about in the Second World War, not only should you not attack civilians, but you also shouldn't attack civilian sites, cultural sites. Okay, and we much criticized the Taliban in Afghanistan that blew up the temple, right? That was a big deal in our press. Well, President Trump has announced that after the Iran business recently, that cultural sites in Iran would be targeted, right? Total violation of international law, right? Now, the thing is, we can sit here and bemoan this, but you better believe that it has each of these little things, and I'm just illustrating little things here, has fundamentally eroded American influence. Okay? It's soft power. And soft power is incredibly difficult to get back. You can ratchet up hard power or ratchet it down, but soft power is something that is developed over centuries and decades. A country that stands for the rule of law, the country that believes in international adjudication, a country that believes in treaties, in trade treaties, and all the rest, all of a sudden blows itself up over a couple of decades and then gets a President Trump who completely blows it up. And we imagine somehow that our military and economic might will sustain us. Or we imagine, more positively, that once Trump goes away and we have a different president, we'll just go back to square one. And I not only doubt it, I think it is hard and fast fact that we cannot go back. Once a country has lost the leverage, soft power leverage that it built up over decades, it can't be recouped. So now we are in a situation where we talk ourselves into the world doesn't matter. We are the most powerful. We are the determinant. We can get rid of trade treaties right and left because we're the most powerful economy. We can go back not to listening to the rules of trade in the WTO, but rather put on tariffs here or there, sanction here or there. All these sanctions, by the way, are a violation of international trade law that we used to adhere to. But the world will see that we've got this incredibly powerful economy and military, and that will keep us into the 21st century to be the leading country in the world. Well, you can tell me I'm wrong, but I think this is all delusional and utter nonsense. Now, we would be not the first country in the world which was a major power, which for a combination of reasons ceased being a major power. After all, the major colonial powers were major powers. They ran the oceans, they ran the sea, they ran trade and so forth. And had to take their place as perfectly okay countries and lesser countries. The question really is whether American egos, including those of progressives and liberals and left-wingers and whatever, American egos allow us to imagine that we're going to live in a world where we're not particularly respected anymore, where our power is still existence in military terms, but no one in particular wants to pay a lot of attention about what we think about anything. Now, I know I always depress you, but would there be a light at the end of this tunnel? I mean, could another president come along and say, okay, we accept the fact we no longer are a hegemon. We accept the fact that we share the world of power with China. We accept the fact that China is not a blooming liberal democracy. We accept the fact that we need some rules, and we will, obey the existing rules and maybe develop some new rules. It's possible, but it seems to me the most likely avenue for the U.S. to recoup some of its mojo, is that the right word, actually comes through climate change. Because climate change is, as we know, the existential threat of this century. We have potentially the know-how, the resources to put shoulder to the wheel on this particular issue. The world is looking for leadership because many of the countries which are very sensitive to climate change themselves can't do very much about it. We were during the Obama administration close to having constructive negotiations with the Chinese about it because they're also anxious actually to do something, even though they can't do anything very quickly about it. because they're such a huge, huge country. But if we became global leaders in climate change, not just in terms of pontification about climate change, but in fact helping countries who don't have the resources to do very much about climate change, this would be a new avenue of foreign assistance that could be rendered without strings, that would be welcome on the one hand, and on the other hand may make a difference. And we have the scientific establishment, if we don't fire all government scientists, which we're in the process of doing, we have the scientific establishment to weigh in and make a major contribution. And I think if we want to recoup on our sort of ethical and moral standing in the world, with all the hypocrisy underneath it, fine. That climate change would be the venue back into the world. It's not better trade relations. It's not some little military pact. It's not, a president who makes things sound good. It's actually having the equivalent of a Marshall Plan, which is a global climate plan, which feeds into every country that wants or needs some support, without being domineering, that is to say, to do it through international institutions, international law, and so forth. That, it seems to me, you may have other ideas, but it seems to me that's the only avenue back for the U.S. to reconstitute some of its leverage, its distinguishing characteristics, its honor in the world, and so forth. So that's one avenue. The second avenue is more problematic, I think, than climate change, and that is linked to climate change, and that has to do with the movement of people in the world. More or less, at least half of the African continent will have to move, unless there are major technological changes. People all over the world will no longer be productive or can no longer live anywhere in the world. You take a country like Egypt, right? Very dependent on water and the Nile and whatever. Then Egypt has many problems that I'm not trying to address them today. But anyway, a major dam is being built in Ethiopia, which will essentially radically, we've all read about it, radically reduce the water flow to Egypt, which essentially means Egypt will economically not become viable anymore. Okay, so here are potential technological fixes that a country devoted to climate change like the U.S. could have a major impact, right? And so the climate change issues and the water issue being one of the dominant issues in this century, shortages of water and too much water somewhere else. The water issues are not resolvable even by a president coming along and preaching we're now interested in climate change, but rather to put our technological know-how to work, because there are ways of recycling water in households, in all kinds of circumstances. There are major inroads being made right now in terms of plant development, changing the genetic makeup of plants so they can produce and continue to produce with considerably less water. There are scientific fixes to a lot of it. And we in the United States have a huge scientific establishment. We could deploy that. So climate change the effects of climate change, one kind or another, seems to me to be the avenue for us in the future. And it's a new form of hard power, if you will. It's not just diplomacy. It is switching hard power away from just military hard power to technological power, which could also be considered hard power, know-how, technological power of one kind or another. In the meantime, the world is fairly chaotic, and in the meantime, somebody is needed out there to make sense of some of the conflicts, to stop having, small conflicts, small wars, and so forth. And you have problems in South Asia, in East Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, all over the place. And the U.S. is not much playing a role. The UN and its agencies is not much playing the role, either because it has no authority or because it doesn't have the resources. So these are festering problems everywhere. And the festering problems for the Trump administration are problems out there which we shouldn't intervene in. And while I'm the first person to say that we've been doing too much intervention, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, there are all kinds of things we shouldn't be doing. Two things in terms of intervention we should be doing. One is the kind of intervention we've been doing is problematic, but there are other forms of intervention, giving other countries the capacity to do things on their own, right? Sharing, exercising soft power leadership is also a type of intervention. It doesn't have to be ugly Americans arriving in your shore and telling you all what to do. It gives you access to information, access to economic resources of one kind or another. So that's one kind of intervention. The other thing that can be done, which will take a long time and is not as jazzy as climate change, is of course to revive some of these international institutions which are still very much needed. And that also requires soft power leadership, because on the one hand, U.S. withdrawing money helps to decimate these organizations, but on the other hand, restructuring leadership is not just a financial issue, it's a leadership issue, it's an idea issue. What kind of WTO, what kind of food and agriculture organization, what should these organizations be doing right now, right? That's an open question, and that actually the U.S. could have some influence in, right? Imaginative, creative ways to say some institutions are no longer needed, let's get rid of them, but some institutions need to be revived in one kind or another. The most obvious, of course, macro institution is the United Nations, which for all practical purposes, does it still exist? I mean, well, we have a lot to do with it not existing, quote unquote, right? And, in the days of, let's say, the 1950s, I guess it was, 60s, 50s, we would even, in terms of representatives that were named, for example, Adlai Stevenson, right, a major figure, right, would represent the United States, right? Who can name the U.S. representatives to the United Nations, U.S. representatives to the United Nations in recent years? Yes, there was John Bolton trying to get rid of the UN, right? But apart from that, we can't even name these people. Who is the current person? Who the hell is that anyway? Oh, some kind of friend of Trump's, right? So it starts at the top. That is to say, even the leadership isn't there, right? Never mind the financing and so forth. Now, why have an institution which developed in the 20th century, why for the 21st century? Because some problems are not regional, they are in fact global. And those global, in a limited kind of way, those global institutions not only can sometimes do things, but they socialize other countries in joint activities. Right? Somebody who has been working next to somebody representing two countries for 5 years in the United Nations, when they go back home and in their foreign affairs ministry, can pick up their cell phone and talk to that person in a way that the rest of us can't. So at some level, those institutions need to be revised. But given the fact that we're no longer dealing with 50-odd countries at the time when the UN was founded, but with almost 200 countries, there's also a very good case to be made for regional mechanisms, right? And we've also been undermining, on the Trump administration, regional mechanisms. We were in favor of Brexit. Let's unspool that. Why is Brexit so bad from a Trump perspective? Because it is some stupid bureaucracy is sitting in Brussels telling sovereign governments what to do. Just the sort of thing we don't want, right? Okay, Brussels bureaucracy needs to be updated, needs to be improved and so forth. But the idea that a bureaucracy which addresses the concerns of some group of Latin American countries or African countries is a waste of time because we are sovereign. And so let me end this hour by saying we have not been sovereign in the technical imagined Trump sense almost forever. Almost forever. Because there's always been a case or an argument where we've had to engage in joint activity and where it was what? In our national interest to do so. I am not suggesting countries should not do things in their national interest. The problematic is, how do you define national interest? And if you define national interest, let's say, on climate change as global, or you define national interest with respect to, let's say, Central America as in the U.S. national interest, then all of a sudden it doesn't become a charitable policy or some kind of thing that you might do when you don't have anything better to do, but rather it becomes a way to exercise influence and influence in your own national interest. And what's so deceptive about the Trump pronouncements on the campaign trail is he makes us feel that we've been taken advantage of, other people have done us in, and we now have to turn to national interest. And what I'm saying in one way or another, maybe not very coherently, of course countries have to act in their national interests. But national interests are not unilateral interests. National interests often are global and regional. That is in your interest. And so national interest badly needs to be defined, and it would be nice if some of our Democratic presidential candidates would talk about it. So let's take a break. So let us start where I left off. The U.S. used to consider itself the indispensable country, and now many countries in the world think we're quite dispensable. Questions, comments, arguments? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So does everybody hear? The U.S. in fact is using its economic power, and it's using its economic power by applying sanctions, not just on Iran, on all kinds of countries, Venezuela, all kinds of countries, Russia, yeah. Is that not a form of economic power? Yes. But it's the kind of power which, in the most immediate sense, has negative consequences in the countries, right? So, for example, the opposition in Iran has now been clamped down because they can see what's happened to them, etc. In the long term, using sanctions, which, by the way, are sort of vaguely illegal, what we're doing, by international legal standards, WTO, and so forth. In the long term, what it does is reduce American influence in soft power, because you know who's doing that to you. And you might not like the leadership in your country, but you also don't like the fact that your hospitals don't have medicines, that your family members are ill and dying, that you're starving in the case of many Venezuelans, and so on, right? So it's a double-edged sword. In the short term, we sure are throwing our sanctioning weight around. That is a major mechanism, and you're quite right in identifying it. In the long term, I think it will have, again, reducing actual American influence on the people in those societies. Yes, it's a secondary sanctioning system. What you're saying to countries is, we've identified a bad country, Iran, Venezuela. And if you do business with them, you're going to also pay the price. Now, it's bad enough in the countries that are where the sanctions are being applied, like Iran or let's say Venezuela or Cuba or whatever. But you better believe that in the long term, even the secondary countries that are told not to trade are saying, what the hell, we are sovereign as well, and the U.S. is throwing its weight around, and that will not sit well. So you're quite right in identifying the secondary layer, but in both cases, the long-term consequences are not to enhance U.S. influence, but will, in the short term, sure, but in the long term, I think it will have very negative consequences. I, of course, could be wrong. Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so we are using all this economic sanctioning stuff, and if that's not going to work, we'll be using our military power to get where we want to get, roughly speaking. That's the question. Probably, and that'll make things even worse. That'll make things worse in terms of the actual influence the U.S. will have on other countries. That will make things worse in terms of, let's say, climate change in those countries. So that's all a downhill trajectory. And the weakening of soft power, which you rightly identify as perhaps hard power then being substituted, is a multifaceted situation. Now, let's imagine, I'm switching it slightly, but let's imagine a situation that in next president, the president after that is not Trump, right? It is a more, and they're saying, okay, we have been very bad at soft power diplomacy. We've been very bad at operating in these institutions. We need to get back to it, right? The first thing the U.S. would face is an absolutely decimated State Department. Because, as a matter of fact, it's not just you and I who are not diplomats saying, oh, well, let's talk to these guys again. The diplomats who've been working for 30 or 40 years out there know something about those countries. They know something about who their opposite numbers are. They know that we're friends, so we can call each other up and, do this, that, and the other thing. So, in point of fact, we don't even have the machinery at this point. Now, am I exaggerating? A little bit, because, for example, you could probably, another president could put National Security Council back together again that was made up of knowledgeable people. What you can't do is instantly put the State Department back together again, because it takes 20, 30, 40 years, whatever, to rise to the top, to get the experience, to have been, sent to 5 or 6 different countries, to speak multiple languages and so on. So that reviving the State Department and our capacity in the State Department will certainly take more than 4 years of a single presidency. National Security Council, Secretary of State, and so forth, those are quicker fixes because there are people out there. So I guess I'm saying you're right in the short term. I think the problem is also in the long term. And I think the problem is not just people with better ideas, but how they can actually implement the ideas given the harm to the structure that you've done. Let's also take an international institution for a minute. An institution that has been battered by the current administration and even the negligence of previous administrations, right? How do you put that back together again to give it some power and authority and to have countries being willing to nominate people to head those institutions who are first rate rather than some bureaucrats, well, he or she is good enough to head the WTO or whatever it is because they're not important anyway, right? So I think it's a more complex issue and a more long-term issue, and for the U.S., obviously, a very serious, at least medium-term issue, it seems to me. Yes, sir. So you're rightly identifying we have a kind of a zero-sum game attitude at this point. They're either for us or against us. You might have noticed that it's not just in terms of foreign policy, it's also in terms of individuals, right? You say make a criticism, four-letter word can be used, you've had it. And the kind of insecurity, here we are, biggest power in the world and whatnot, and the insecurity of latching out at any country or any leader that even modestly criticizes us, right? That is also not a way a secure person or a secure country behaves, right? Somebody is critical of some aspect of what you're doing. What you do is you talk to the people, you negotiate, you see where the compromise can be found. There's none of that. It's either, black or white, and we don't pay any attention to it. And that is not the way of soft power. That is not the way of diplomacy. And the problematic would be serious if there were still 50 countries in the world, but with 200 countries in the world, what you essentially do is you disregard most of them. They're just small fry. You don't even have to listen to those guys, except when they then have terrorists or something, right? And the extension of U.S. military power is not just the obvious one of larger military budgets and new nuclear weapons, right? We're going to have missiles with nuclear warheads now that we didn't have before, and all the rest of it. It's also that we have essentially American, let me step back, we actually are echoing what Russia is doing, which is not only to have a powerful and capable military, but to hire armies of mercenaries that we send every which way to presumably do our bidding, but in most of the circumstances they're making it worse, right? We have mercenaries, American mercenaries all over Africa. We have mercenaries in Libya, but so do the Russians and all the rest of it. That reduces control. It makes private, pretty much contracted individuals do things that American mercenaries did, for example, in Iraq, like kill people and then they're not found guilty, right? Our Secretary of Education's brother, right, heads one of these organizations. And it leads to a kind of warlessness, which makes it then more comprehensible, when Trump says, we're in too many places in the world, we need to get out. That sounds okay, actually. It sounds reasonable. Why are all these mercenaries all over the place? And they shouldn't be. But it's not confined to that. That is to say, he's not just saying, let's get mercenaries out. He's also doing very much harm in the way they're going out. For example, the business of abandoning the Kurds in Syria, right? It's one thing to say, let's pay the Kurds to help us in this mess in Syria. It's another thing to say, well, we can just abandon them overnight, right? That has an impact globally, not just on the Kurds, but on everybody in the Middle East and on everybody. You be allied with the United States, Trump the next day can throw you under the bus, right? And that too is an erosion of confidence in the U.S. as an actor. Yes, Bagnes. Well, how do we keep peace between the United States and China? I think one of the better ways to keep peace between two countries is to start out by making them feel that they're respected. That's usually a good start, and to take them seriously. The second thing is when you have policies, to try to not be erratic about it and vengeful about it. Third, to accept a world in which there are very different political systems, very different actors, and you may not like the regime in a particular country, but you have to figure out a way, A, to deal with it. Not dealing with it is the worst possible thing. B, to assure that country that dealing with each other does not have to be a military dealing, right? And to, in a sense, recognize that the movement from authoritarian regimes to less authoritarian regimes or even democratic regimes is a slow process that can be encouraged through respect and interaction and having role models of countries that work better. I mean, after all, let's go back to Iran for a minute, the smaller country. There was every reason to believe that Iranians increasingly were fed up with their regime. And it might have, in a few years' time, have led to a different regime. There was every reason to believe that the Iraqis were fed up with the Iranians in their midst, as were the Lebanese. By undermining that, right? By attacking the country, attacking their nation, attacking their nationalism, right? As compared to attacking the regime. What you did is you forestalled for a long time that people sometimes right themselves in their own way. And so I think that China is a problem. If it were democratic, it would be a problem because it's a major country, it's a competitor, and so forth. It's a problem given its particular authoritarian regime. But the least likely way of getting rid of the authoritarian regime is to attack it and to act as if, you can preach to other people and approach it with the arrogance with which we approach other countries and societies. That doesn't mean I like the government in China at all, or Iran, or whatever. But the question is, how do you get to where you want to get? And it seems to me the way we're proceeding is in opposite to making what we would like to see down the road happen. I mean, that would be my... Yes, Mark? So, soft power means influence, right? And so far, our approach to climate change is that it doesn't exist and to have gotten out of the climate treaty. Now, I would be the first to say that the International Climate Treaty was badly flawed, that it, even if everybody adhered to it, which they don't, and they haven't, the situation would still be dire. So from that perspective, saying we're out of the business of climate change globally essentially means that we have no influence on a bilateral basis preaching to others. That's how it starts, right? To tell the Germans that they should stop burning coal, or to tell the Chinese that they're not making quick enough progress in terms of climate change, is not very helpful when you're not at the forefront of identifying it as a problem and saying that given your global capacity, given your resources, given your scientists, you want to help others not only set standards, but to achieve them. Right? So first, it seems to me it's a question of leadership and psychology. Right? And leadership and psychology in the U.S. has to come from the top. Not because it always has to come from the top, but because Trump, from the top, nixed it. It now requires somebody from the top sort of saying, we're going to reverse course on this. And constantly telling people that we are doing better in terms of dealing with climate change than these other countries is not terribly helpful, because we, being as affluent as we are and having as many options as we have, are in a better position than most countries. And many countries, are in, they need fuel, and the only fuel available to them is, coal-based or oil-based or whatever. So it seems to me one is changing the trajectory of our policy goals, not for ourselves, but for the world. Ourselves being a role model in some ways, and ourselves consciously throwing our weight of our scientific establishment as well as our economic establishment in the direction of helping people of one kind or another. And, that's, I'm being very kind of general, but you almost have to go specifically in terms of a particular country, its particular problems, how they can be addressed, and so on. Let's take Brazil for a minute. Some of you are Latin American fans. Brazil's rainforest is not a Brazilian issue, it's a global issue, right? Brazil has an authoritarian government. The authoritarian government is, in a sense, saying, cut down the forest because what we're really interested is building up the economy and our trade. And it's very easy to do that in the face of American trade relations with China, because China needed an alternative to our soybeans. And when we put on sanctions of selling soybeans to China, China looked for other markets, and a good market for their soybeans came from Brazil. And the Brazilian government says, you know, within a year we can produce the soybeans you guys need. We're going to cut down our forests and sow our soybeans. Okay? So we have a kind of a particular case here. Right? Go case by case. Well, to begin with, of course, our U.S. government, likes Brazil a lot because their authoritarian leader because Trump likes other authoritarian leaders who are in control. So that we're on friendly terms with the head of the Brazilian government. Second of all, we've botted out in terms of climate change. I mean, our scientists might be wringing their hands about what's happening in Brazil, but the U.S. government is okay. I mean, the formal departments of the U.S. government, it isn't. So it's not just that we need to reverse. I mean, it's not just we need better policies. We actually need to reverse course on saying to a country, if you stop attacking your natural environment, we will help you, or at least we won't undermine your economic situation. So on the one hand, I'm sort of saying the whole climate change and U.S. leadership has to come from the top and be very general and global and international. On the other hand, I'm saying we've got retail stuff to do with respect to different countries, different products, our own farmers, and the rest. So it doesn't have a simple fix, but the fix is at different levels, it seems to me. That's not a satisfactory response, but best I can do. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, most Americans and certainly most Republicans and Trump people ignore the climate stuff, are led by representatives who ignore it. And so it's not just get Trump out. What about the whole Republican Party? And what about the socialization of our fellow citizens? Yeah, well, that's easy. That's easy. So let's start at the micro level. Being able to be climate sensitive has up until now primarily be a possibility for the privileged. And I include all of us, no matter how little your income on Social Security is. You're the ones, I'm the one, that can go to specialty stores, buy products that are recyclable, that are useful to use, that don't do harm in the environment. If you are a working class American, if your income is under $100,000 a year, and you go to Walmart, you're going to buy the cheapest product. Never mind how it's produced, where it's produced, and so on. So it has become, in the U.S., it's become kind of an elite affectation to say, oh, I recycle. Somebody told me the other day that I shouldn't be using regular toilet paper. I should be using toilet paper that's made out of bamboo. Well, I'm sure that that's a good idea. And I'm sure if push came to shove, I can find a store and I can pay twice as much for my toilet paper rather than getting it at Costco, right? So it's a class problem to some extent. And unless governments help people at the bottom and the middle to do more sensible things and make it economically affordable, the political leaders which say, this is a problem for other people, it's not your problem, it's nice to have electric cars, but if you can barely afford a 15-year-old cars that pumps things out, you're not in the market for an electric car. So it becomes a very complicated issue to turn people's attitudes around by making it economically feasible to do the right thing, quote unquote, Now, we in California, for example, have made little inroads, for example, making solar cheaper, right? So now people who were not able to afford solar 20 years ago can afford solar now. And that could also happen with different products. If you make recycling of water affordable, that, could happen. But in some ways, it's that sort of at the ground level. In other ways, I don't think it has to be a Republican Democrat idea. It's the Republicans right now are humming whatever it is that Trump administration is humming, because under United Citizens, the only way they're going to get money to get reelected is from the center, and who doles out the money, right? I simply do not believe that all the Republican legislatures are so ignorant that they cannot see that dumping more chemicals into the local rivers and taking the regulations away is in anybody's interest. It's insane, yes, but it's also rational. That is to say, we can't assume that people are irrational. People are rational. And so, well, not everybody, I may not be, but you might be. But the issue is, how can you make it rational for people to live differently? And that is not a party issue. That is a national issue. You could easily have Republican congressmen and senators and presidents who are saying, listen, folks, we're all in this together. We will give you write-offs, let's say, if you buy those products versus that. Or we will give you bonuses if you, buy a bicycle or a motor or whatever it is, electric bicycle, whatever. So that switch has to happen. And it's happened in some countries. It can happen. For example, some of the Scandinavian countries, even the poorest people in Finland know there's a climate change issue, and they're able to contribute to their society to be climate change helpful. It's also an educational issue. I mean, some of the kids, Greta and so forth get it. But do our school children get it? I don't think so. And when they go home and say, mother and father, we now need to use, different kind of toilet paper, the parents say, yeah, just go to the bathroom and use the toilet paper, right? So it's very complex and multifaceted. I simply do not believe that in 5 or 10 years' time, this cannot be turned around. And at the moment, it seems, the climate issue cannot be turned around. At the moment, it seems totally hopeless because all the Republicans, like sheep, are following this. Let's get rid of all those testy regulations. Now we're going to do exploration in Utah, in all the hills, and destroy the natural environment. I think most Republicans in California actually are in favor of safeguarding the environment, as a matter of fact, even if they're totally sort of right-wing, quote-unquote, on other things. So it can be done. It has to be done. It requires leadership, but not just on top everywhere else. And I think the lockstep in support of Trump can be stopped once the Senate and the president are not controlling all the funds, right, which in turn are controlled in a particular direction. I think, optimistically, that could happen. You don't think so? All right, I'm trying to be optimistic. Okay, you say people act in short-term gain. I think that's true. I think that's almost always been true. So there's nothing new about it. So the thing is, how can you produce some short-term gain on the climate side? It doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. There are lots of Democrats out there in the center of our country who are anti any remedial stuff in terms of climate change as well. So how do you produce that? You produce that by having incentives. And incentives can be produced in one way or another, either by making things cheaper to access or allowing people to, for example, recycle water. I've talked about this before. I'm absolutely convinced that within a decade, most homes in industrial countries will have refrigerator-sized gadgets which recycle all the water in the house, right? That will become cheap and accessible, especially to Americans and our level of whatnot. There are other things out there that can help in one way or the other. So I'm actually, while I know I always depress you and I always sound negative, I'm actually a lot more optimistic than a lot of people are, that one can't just throw in the towel, but can find out little triggers that can help people identify issues. So in the middle of our country right now, where there's one tornado after another and one flood or another, a Republican congressman can say, for example, I think climate change has something to do with it. So how exactly should our community address that? And there are actually some people out there like that. So it requires more, it requires momentum. It's not a quick fix, but other countries have begun to make progress. And I can't believe that we, supposedly the most inventive, whatever country in the world, can't make some progress if we want to. Now, there is a fly in my more optimistic ointment, and that is, you've probably seen in the newspaper that by 2040, 30% of Americans will elect 70% of our senators, congressmen, whatever. Okay? Because the populations are going to urban areas. And actual urban areas have the capacity to do things about climate change. Because there's the money, there's the intensity, and so forth. And unless we change our electoral system in some fashion, this will keep repeating itself. Because every state where almost no one lives has 2 senators, gets 2 representatives. So those people are the majority, and they're not where the population is. Okay. So some structural changes need to be made in the U.S. to produce better political outcomes, it seems to me, and represent the majority of the people, which is currently not the case. How you get from here to there, I am not sure, but from here to, I think this next election will probably demonstrate some movement needs to be made to get from here to there. Yes, ma'am. I'm neither willing nor able. You know that, yeah, well, so did the people in New Hampshire. They went to the polls and they said, I'm still not sure. The general thing is we want somebody who can win, but who knows who that is. Yeah. Has Donald Trump ever said, like the Roman Empire, that he doesn't want to, that he's not going to become empire? Could I just intervene in your question? That's not true, because Trump has said that he wants to stay on besides his second 4-year term. Do I see an emperor in the future of the United States? I think I have more faith in American people than that. I think that people go along for a long time, all kinds of things. Many of you are old enough to remember the McCarthy era. We've had other bad spells in American history, and we've managed to overcome them. Admittedly, now under new conditions. I'm the first one to admit. But still in all, I think that you can push Americans only so far, and then there'll be a counter push of one. Yeah, with California and the states on the West Coast who are cognizant of climate change, would they be powerful to, influence? Well, in many ways, of course, they have already. That's not just a futuristic thing. I mean, California and Seattle and Washington and Oregon have gone a long way of themselves enacting policies. The problem, of course, is that some of those policies are being nixed by the central government. By the central government saying the states have no rights to do the following, to have different, let's say, emission standards, or to have different immigration standards, or whatever the case may be. So that's a conflict that those kind of conflicts easily arise and easily allow the federal government to, put their foot on the pedal. On the other hand, California and to some extent the other West Coast states are actually in a much better position already to have addressed climate change stuff than some of the other states have. So on the one hand, on the other. Why is military expenditure such a good idea? Well, it's a fine idea for Trump because he wants to say we're the most powerful military country in the world. And by the way, all the various treaties to reduce military nuclear warfare, the START Treaty, the Intermediate Range Treaty, and so forth, were unilaterally nixing them or refusing to renew them and so forth, because, I'll get to your question in a minute, but because up until now, there has been the idea that it is in the Russian and Chinese interests to join with the US to keep the small fry from getting nuclear weapons. And also, since during previous administrations, there was a reduction in the number of nuclear capacity of one kind or another, that it was also overkill because both Russia and the United States can wipe out the world and each other and all the rest of it. So they had a joint interest in non-nuclear proliferation and a joint interest in not using such a high proportion of their budget on further military development. Well, as soon as the U.S. got into the business of saying we need more military development and more nuclear development, of course the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and everybody else says, okay, so we're going to build up our arsenal. We're now back into a nuclear arms race because we have nixed several decades of careful management of nuclear capacity for most countries. Talk about the Middle East a little bit next time. That's a relevant issue there as well. However, that's not exactly the question you asked. The second part of the question is, in whose interest is this? Well, in Trump's interest, it's power, right, to some extent. But lots and lots of people have a very keen interest in all of this, and they're not just all Republicans, they're Democrats as well, because there's huge amount of money to be made in their hills. The military-industrial complex that we used to talk about in the days of yore is one of the biggest money makers in the United States. If you're in that business, you make tons of money. Where does that money go? It goes into your pocket, but it also funds campaigns. It also funds representatives. It also funds the government. So the money machine that is part of enhancing military spending is huge, and it is in the interest of politicians. Certainly in the interest of Trump and all his friends, but also to more or less every Republican, and I would argue half the Democrats. They're dependent on the resources that are coming from that particular complex. So in order to change a reduction in military spending and a reduction in the money making of those corporations and move it, let's say, in environmental stuff, is a major thing that even local Congress people would have to confront, because they too get money from those industries. Well, since we have a volunteer army is effectively also mercenaries, do we want to bring the draft back? I'm not enthusiastic about bringing the draft back, and I'm not enthusiastic about the mercenary army either. I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question, because a professional army, which is a voluntary army, is something that most countries have, and it's probably an okay idea. If hiring non-trained military people or, mercenaries, the French used to have the Foreign Legion, right? All over, we've read novels and stuff and seen movies all over North Africa and stuff. I think that in a world which prides itself on having some rules of military engagement, some laws having to do with military engagements, all kinds of rules about how people who engage in military engagement should behave, in that kind of a world, I think mercenaries are a different kind of danger than even a voluntary mercenary army. So I think professional armies, you're not going to outlaw those. I can't see it. Every country has them. Um, deciding not to send the professionals out there and instead of saying mercenaries, I think is asking for trouble. Yes, but the military, yeah, I know that's what you asked. I'm sorry, I sort of evaded that. Um, the draft, because we're not in a war, the draft would just pertain to relatively few people, right? That many people wouldn't be drafted. And then the question is, who gets drafted? Is it randomly by number? Do you have the kind of Vietnam mess in terms of draft resistors? And so that raises a whole new ball of wax. It's not like World War II where everybody gets drafted and everybody goes to war, right? You don't need that much of a military to have every young man in the country be potentially drafted. And then you're going to get corruption like crazy in terms of the people who actually have to go in. The Trumps of this world will have foot difficulties and won't have to serve. And the poor Slav who is unemployed in Watson will be the cannon fodder for the military. I think it's not a solution. But I could be wrong. I think everybody after high school should do national service, and I think those that will want to go in the military should go to the military. They should have slightly better benefits and health or whatever than the people who don't go to the military. But I think it would make a huge difference in society if everybody had national service. And I think the countries in the world that have national service really benefit from that. So then, of course, that is partly related to your question, because then, of course, a certain number of people will say, I want the military because I want to work, go into a foreign country and I want a uniform and so forth, and you would get volunteers then on that basis. That I would be in favor of, but not the rest. I should liberate you